Good evening, everybody. My name is Bronwyn Strong with the Natural History Society of Maryland, and we're so excited that you have joined us to learn with us about lichens. And we are excited to have Natalie back. This is her second time with us, same subject. And she has a wealth of knowledge and experience that she has graciously agreed to share with us. So, Natalie, the floor is yours.
So much, Bronwyn. This is such a treat to get to talk with you all. And as Bronwyn said, if you have questions as I'm going along, it would be super if you put them in the chat and then Bronwyn will interject and ask them to me. So it'll be a little more interesting than just one person talking and talking and talking while you're trying to digest your dinner or reflect on your afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. So I'm going to share my screen here with my PowerPoint. Here we go. So I thought it would be fun, like a fun theme to frame the lichens and to talk about some lichenologists of our area. I unfortunately didn't think to include the California lichenologists, but would love to collaborate with some of the West Coasters to try and to make a more nationwide friendly presentation about it. But my identification with the lichen community really is because the other lichenologists are so fun and thoughtful, and because we get to do adventures that I think are really fun, like the one depicted in this slide. We have an excuse to go out in a swamp in the beginning of the springtime and check it out really closely to see what's growing there and to get to appreciate that swamp a little more. And so I hope that at the end of the talk you'll appreciate the lichens a little more, and I hope that you enjoy the time here. So one thing that I am thinking a lot about during the coronavirus time is like how to build community when I'm mostly staying at home, because like I said, one of the things I love about being a natural history enthusiast is connecting with other people over outdoor adventures like hikes. And this is a picture of a group of lichenologists in GALS, or Greater Atlanta Lichen Society, which explored some really great habitats in northern Georgia and southern North Carolina, because that part of the country is amazing for lichens. If you live there, you're lucky. But not only going on hikes to explore the lichens is really fun, but it's also fun then to go on picnics after the hikes and chat with the other people about why they're into it and what awesome finds they had just in that spot that you never even noticed. James Lennemer, who's the person on the right of this picnic picture, actually did a really neat study and found like when two people go out who have the same amount of experience, the overlap in their species finding is surprisingly low, just because you end up looking in different spots, and because lichens are so habitat specialized, there's always more things to find, which is part of why it's so fun to be out in a group like this. And not because, as many of you know from being natural history enthusiasts, like a lot of details about it are not actually that easy to learn just by walking by and looking at it. And so this has been a really great experience for me to get to like explore a whole new world with a microscope. And one of the great things about Natural History Society of Maryland is that they, and a lot of groups like California Lichen Society, is that they can help people have access to microscopes, get used to using them, think about whether they want to get one themselves or whether they want to engage with a local educational institution that has microscopes, so they can explore that that microscopic natural history world a little better. And so when you're in a group, of course, a few people can identify a few specimens, you can put them all together like in this picture, and you can identify that whole community of fungi or lichens or insects or bryophytes or whatever your group is most interested in. So I have really loved being a part of that group. And so remotely, it's been a little harder to connect in that way, but I hope that this will be a fun experience for you from Natural History Society of Maryland, and but from tons of other groups who are also offering so many neat, like, educational online workshops. With that, I wanted to say that I'm focusing on lichens themselves for so many reasons. First of all, just because I think they're fascinating. I'm not sure if this is going to show up, but I have a specialty outfit for today, which is "How You Lichen Me Now," a t-shirt with lichens on it. And so I want to tell you about how they're, like, fascinating in what they look like, where they live, what they can do in the habitat, how diverse they are, how many places they can live, and just aesthetically how amazing they look. So I'm going to start this talk about talking about what is a lichen, and then talk about why I love lichens and what is so interesting about them. I feel like that's sort of the compelling part to help people think, like, okay, well then why is it worth it to spend all my time on a microscope or in a long discussion about spores to try and figure out what's what. And then I'm going to talk about local lichenology lore, focusing on some of the lichens that I find most frequently in the area where I live, which is the mid-Atlantic region in the Northeast corridor. And so most of my lichenology experience has been in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. And so right in this, and in Maryland. And so in the Northeast corridor. But I would love it if those of you who are from other parts of the country who want to chime in and how what we're talking about fits in with your lichen community, be really happy to hear that. You can chat in a comment as well as a question, and Bronwyn will interrupt, and we can talk about that too. And finally, I want to talk about how you can learn lichens. So as you see from these, like, 4 parts, it's geared a little more towards introducing people to lichens. But if you have, like, a more technical question or something, I'm happy to try it, and we'll talk about that too. So just let me know what you're interested in talking about, and I can elaborate more or less on things. So let's do it. What is a lichen is what I'm going to start with. And I think a lot of you know, because you signed up here, that lichens are composite organisms made out of fungi and photosynthesizing organisms and bacteria. And so but they're not just like, it's not just like a stew of 3 things, because I love this picture with a Cladonia cristatella fungus on one side, a Trabuxia alga on the other side. And when you grow them separately, they grow as individual cells. The Cladonia cristatella grows on hyphae in its medium, but it has, when it grows together, this emergent property, which is this amazing and beautiful British soldier lichen structure, which are these little stalks with red tops that grow on decomposing logs that are like decorations that make the decomposing logs sing in the forest, compared to what you usually expect from a decomposing log. So it's also important to remember that it's not only those major parts that are really important for lichen, but just like bacteria are in our digestive system are really important for us, bacteria in the system of the lichen are also important to its functioning, although the details about what exactly each bacterium does is a little less well understood than what the fungus and the algae do. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. The fungus itself is like the main part of the biomass of the lichen. And so even though the lichen is made of a lot of things, you don't list 3 species when you talk about lichens. And most people don't call them, when they don't call it the lichen community when they talk about one entity. They mainly just name the name of the fungus. And the fungus itself is a specialized kind of fungus. Like a lot of times I teach a fungus class. And so a lot of times what people are interested in with fungi are fungi that are parasites, like the fungi that make zombies out of insects and infect the insects, or fungi that that infect people and cause really, difficult to treat diseases. And so pathogenic fungi, which eat their host, are really important to agriculture and medicine. But lichen fungi don't eat their host. Many kinds of fungi secrete enzymes to digest whatever they're growing on. In this picture, the fungus is secreting enzymes to digest the components of the soil that it's growing through. But the fungus that's affiliated with a lichen is sucking sugars out of the photosynthesizing organism that it's growing with. So it can be living on one like if it's living on one substrate, it'll suck its sugars out of the algae and it won't suck its sugars off whatever it's growing on. And so that's like one confusing thing that people think about lichens, because they're so used to thinking about fungi as pathogens that decompose things. If they see a lichen on a tree, they think, oh gosh, what is that lichen sucking out of the tree? What disease is it giving the tree? But a lot of times the lichen is not, the lichen isn't affiliated with the disease. The tree might also be diseased with a different fungus, but the lichen fungus is not part of the disease fungus. It's just living there on the bark, getting its food out of the photosynthesizing organism and not out of the tree. So I'm going to highlight the little algae here in this picture of the lichen fungus. They're getting their food from the little tiny algal cells that are embedded within them. And so I also wanted to talk a little bit more about those photosynthesizing organisms, because a lot of people think that a fungus plus algae makes lichen, but it's not necessarily always an alga. It could be any kind of photosynthesizing organism, and there are any kind of photosynthesizing organism between these two, which are algae or cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria are a kind of bacterium that also photosynthesize, and nostoc is one of the common taxa that lichenized fungi affiliate with. And so I put up the photosynthesis equation. I used to be a general biology teacher. And so, we talked a lot about this. This is like one of the core aspects of life on our planet. And it's so fundamental to us, but it's also fundamental to lichens. Because because lichens are eating the sugar off of their photosynthesizing organism, what they really need is the right amount of sun for that photosynthesizing organism and the right amount of water. And the right amount of air, just like any kind of photosynthesizing organism. But so if, for example, a lichen is living on a tree limb and that tree limb falls off and the lichen's on the bottom, it gets no sunlight, the lichen's going to die. But one thing that's amazing about lichens is how they respond to water. So they can dry out, and when they get water, then they'll start photosynthesizing. They'll start making sugars. But then when they don't have enough water, they can halt that. And so that's an amazing thing about the habitats they can live in. And but they need some availability of water some of the time in order to survive and grow here. So that was one of the things that I wanted to emphasize about what's so important about how this photosynthesizing organism contributes to the food source for the lichen. And finally, not only do some lichens have a green algae, most lichens in the Northeast are green algal affiliate lichens, and the cyanobacterial lichens are less common, especially in urban areas, which are the ones that I usually see. And so I think it's pretty fun and exciting to see a cyanobacterial lichen. The way you can tell is you can do a little cut through it, and you can see if there's a black layer, it's a cyanobacterial lichen. Sometimes you have to cut through it and put it in a microscope to tell exactly. But if there's a green layer, then it's a green alga.
Hey, Natalie.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Bronwyn.
Great.
So we know that the fungi get the sugars. What did the algae or the bacteria get in return?
Well, so on some level, it seems like it's called, a lot of ecologists will consider this the lichen symbiosis, which is to say the fungus and the photosynthesizer are living together. And it's one of the classic examples of a mutualism where both things benefit. But mutualisms in ecology are so sort of weird and temporary, just like actually in a society. Somebody in your life could be like really helpful to you at one point and then like be even detrimental to you at a different point in their lives, depending on what they're doing and how they're behaving. And so similarly, the fungus and the algae need each other to survive in the lichen, and the fungus absorbs water really well. And so that ability is helpful for the alga because the algae will survive. For example, if a free alga and a lichen are living together on the same bark or rock, the free algae will dry out, dry out and get water it'll dry out faster. Whereas the fungus can absorb water, and so it can sort of pass it to the algae, and so that helps it like buffer its habitat a little more. The fungus also has an amazing chemical arsenal, which I'm going to talk about later, and that chemical arsenal can help defend the alga against ultraviolet radiation, and sometimes it makes really nasty compounds, as we know if any of us have friends or family who don't like to eat mushrooms or who have eaten mushrooms that cause them indigestion. The fungus also has a great anti-herbivore function. And sometimes you'll see lichens that have been grazed. Like there's some great pictures of slugs that have grazed the lichens, and what they're really going for is the alga, because the alga has the sugars, and has more sugars and fewer defensive compounds, and so the fungi help defend it. But some people think that like if the algae can live freely, or it can live getting its sugar sucked out, that seems like in a way a bad deal. And so some people conceptualize it that the fungi have captured the alga for agricultural purposes, just like we capture some plants for agricultural purposes too. Thanks for the question. One thing I wanted to point out is I mentioned it a little before, is that the lichen has bacteria and algae in there, but it also has a lot of things. This is a great study from 2011 talking about a sort of diversity of organisms that have been sequenced from lichen, little bits that got stuck in lichens or parts that are more seriously and consistently affiliated with lichens. And so I sort of love this analogy about not only is a lichen a fungus plus a photosynthesizer, but it's like a lasagna. It's so much more delightful thanks to all of these little components. The main one is the fungus, and algae or cyanobacteria are usually the second most abundant, but there's a lot of other things going on there. And so that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about what we're looking at with the lichen. But most people who are interested in natural history like to know what they're encountering in the forest and what they're looking at. And so I wanted to spend some time in the what is a lichen, helping you figure out, what to expect when you're going to find some lichens. And always there's going to be some fungal hyphae, which are these strings of fungus. Always there's going to be some kind of photosynthesizer, which in this case is a green alga. It's depicted, it's like colored in here in this science photo library photo to show you where the algae is. It sort of makes sense as towards the top of the lichen because it can catch the sun there towards the top better, but it's got a little protective layer. And again, this can all absorb a lot of water to help the alga photosynthesize. But they can be arranged in so many different ways, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So one of the ways that's like easy to see, easy to notice, one of the first lichens that I learned was a foliose lichen, a flat lichen that you can peel right off its surface. And I put in our area, I should have put in the mid-Atlantic region because foliose lichens are particularly common here. But like Chris was saying, in the Sonoran Desert, different lichen growth forms are going to be more common there. This one's a picture of Flavoparmelia caparata, or green shield lichen. I fear that my picture itself is a little washed out, but it's this great yellow-green color that's really distinctive. Some people confuse lichens and mosses are sort of like, a lot of times, of course, mosses can have a big variety of colors, and the bryologists on the call will fault me if I say that, well, mosses are always green, and lichens can be a little green, but usually they're a little grayer green than the mosses are, and they have these different growth forms. The moss and that help you distinguish the moss and the lichen when you're looking at them growing in the same habitat. This one, the Cladonia lichens, like the one behind me in my screenshot, are round in their cross section, so they look sort of like corals, or they look like shrubs, and they represent a smaller proportion of lichens in the Maryland area. But this is the kind of lichen that I did my dissertation research on, because it's one of the ones that grows on soil, and so it can have a really interesting interaction with the soil organisms and the soil chemistry. And so anyway, these reindeer lichens, in this case it's Cladonia subtenuis, but there's a big group of reindeer lichens that grow looking like this, and they can grow as little like shrubs in the ground, or they can grow as lichens dripping off of trees. And those of you in the Pacific Northwest will recognize that growth form, because that is one of the sort of abundant and dramatic and gorgeous aspects of lichen communities in that area. And then finally, crustose lichens grow stuck on the surface. They're sort of like, it looks almost as though they're painted on, and they are a huge diversity of the lichens in the mid-Atlantic region and Northeast, as well as most diversity of lichens on the planet. This smoky eye boulder lichen, or Porpidia albocerulescens, which is the one that I have a picture of here, is really distinctive because it looks, actually some people confuse it for bird poop, because it's also like a smear on the rock. But the difference is it's going to have these gray structures that are holding the spores that I'll talk about in a minute. And so that's one good way to tell a lichen from some other material you'll be encountering in the forest. But those are the three like major growth forms, and the three sort of major steps in lichen keys when you're trying to identify them. But there are some other ways that lichens can grow, and so I thought it would be like useful and interesting to talk about that, just to help you like identify the lichen diversity that you're seeing. And that's these other sort of less common but important and interesting growth forms, one of which is leprose, or powdery lichens. There's a genus called Lobaria that has a lot of these powdery lichens, and so those are a little hard to tell from just a fungus growing over the surface, or an algae, a mat of algae growing over the surface, because they're missing some of the distinctive features that some of these other foliose, fruticose, and crustose lichens have. This other group, the squamulose growth form, is sort of like cereal pieces growth form, because it's tiny little pieces of flat bits of lichen that are growing a lot of times on the soil, a lot of times on logs. And this is a picture of a Cladonia species from a log. And finally, another kind of fungus that is a lot of times in a lichen key is called a stubble lichen, which are tiny pins. And this fungal group is a lot of times considered in lichen literature because it's growing in a lot of lichen habitats. And Troy McMullen of the Canadian Museum of Nature is a great specialist on these lichens. They're really tiny, and they're such a fun surprise to find. But they're not like they're not like the other lichens that they're not like the lichens that you find structurally, at least. And so those are like the main ways that the lichen is organized. But just like in a forest, the plants are organized as trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants and non-vascular plants. But the way that you identify a lot of plants is by their fruiting bodies. And so similarly, the way that you identify a lot of fungi is by their fruiting bodies. And most lichens are ascomycete fungi, which means they reproduce with their spores in a sac. And so this is the picture of a sac called an ascus with 8 little spores in it. But that can be arranged in a lot of different ways. And so I wanted to show some pictures of some reproductive structures that you'll see on the lichens. And so, for example, if you see a white smear on a tree or a rock, it's really important to look for the reproductive structure there, because that's what's going to identify it sometimes if it's a sexually reproducing lichen. So one of the ones that I think is a real fun find is Graphis scripta, or any of the Graphis lichens, really. They look like somebody has taken a pen to the tree or rock and written little weird things that you can't understand because it's not in a person spoken language, but it's not, of course, it's not writing on the tree. It's just fruiting bodies of the fungus. A common way that fruiting bodies are arranged is in little circles. And so you'll sometimes see them with a rim like this. Sometimes you'll just see black circles. Sometimes you'll see different color circles. There's one genus of lichen called hematoma, just like a person when you have like a blood spot on your skin, that fruiting body can be bright red. Like the one on the right is called a British soldier lichen, because its fruiting body is bright red like the hat of a British soldier. There's a lot, this one is Cladonia chrysotella, but there's a lot of different British soldier lichens that have red tops like that. But just like sometimes, well, if you're in a herbarium, if you're seeing an ideal specimen of a lichen, a lot of times it'll have the fruiting body because that helps in identifying it. But many lichens don't reproduce sexually. They only reproduce asexually. So if you have a sexually reproducing one, you'll be able to cut that fruiting body and look at it in a microscope. Another one of the great things about lichenology is it lets you look at this cool thing from so many different perspectives. And so when you're slicing open the lichen, you can look at the spores, which help you in identifying it. Sometimes you're not so lucky. You don't have sexual reproduction structures on the lichen, so you try and identify it by its asexual parts. And this is a interesting feature of the lichens because they are made of the fungus plus the photosynthesizing organism. If it reproduces asexually, both those things are stuck together. And so it can more easily go and establish someplace else, as opposed to if the fungus spore just goes off on its own, up in the air, looking for a place with the right amount of sun, the right amount of water, and the photosynthesizing organism that goes along with it. So these are two kinds of structures that lichens reproduce by, which is soiridia, which are grainy or powdery material on the surface of the lichen, or isidia, which are like finger-like extensions. And it seems like, well, who cares? It does the same function, breaking off and starting a new lichen someplace else. But the different asexual reproduction structures are really helpful in helping you identify it. And so if you're going through a lichen key, some species will only reproduce in one of these ways. And so, so that's why I wanted to highlight the differences. So those are some of the ways that you can figure out what is a lichen if you see it, if you see it growing in a forest or wetland or other neat habitat. But the next part is about why you should love lichens. And I thought this study by Aaron Tripp, who's a botanist and lichenologist at the University of Colorado in Boulder, was really, and James Lendemer, who's a lichenologist at the New York Botanical Garden, and also my lichenology mentor, was a really great study. And I'm very happy to have a nationwide slide for those of you who are not from the Maryland area, because it shows how amazing the diversity of lichens is, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. In this map, the red shows up as very high lichen diversity spots, and the blue shows up as lower lichen diversity spots. And so the one interesting thing about this, which is represented by this little diagram on the right, is that there's generally more lichen diversity in North America as you go north compared to the southern part. And my job is in botany, and so when we're thinking about where are the invasive plants and where are the habitats with the most diversity of plants, it's always in South Florida. And but lichens have the opposite trend. They're more diverse the farther north you are, and so that is a fascinating aspect of their ecology. And of course, that's a general trend. But as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of different reasons why a lichen would be in an area or wouldn't be in an area. And as you also see, besides the Pacific Northwest, there are also a few lichen hotspots along the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the southern Appalachians. And so there's so many neat things, and in Maine. So there's so many neat things you can find really anywhere with lichen communities. The main habitats you find them on are soils, rock, deadwood, and bark. And I put bark habitat as separate from deadwood because actually there's some lichens that grow, there's some lichens that are on the bark, the tree falls down, they stay growing in the bark habitat, that's fine. But there are some that grow on more decomposed wood. And there are some that only grow in some types of the tree, like in the canopy, because the moisture and the light are so different in the canopy compared to the understory of a forest. There are some that are only going to grow on the living tree, and when the tree falls down, that species is not going to survive on the bottom layer of the forest. And so that's a sort of interesting feature about how the lichens survive in the forest. But they're also neat because they grow in other stable habitats that, like, we think of, wait a minute, this is a sort of volunteer biodiversity that comes into some of our built-in environment, like unused boats or unused cars or metal bridges. And even in the southern part of the US, we have some foliculous lichens, or lichens that live on leaves. And again, they can do that because they have that sugar source, that constant sugar source that they're carrying around like a lunchbox within them. And so they don't need to get their food off of a metal bridge in Rock Creek Park or off of an unused boat in New Jersey. They have that food with them. And so that's why they can live in these seemingly formidable habitats. And I really loved, this study by Troy McMullen of the Canadian Museum of Nature, who was studying an urban forest and found that actually, yes, there were a lot of lichens on rock and bark. He found 104 different species, but some of them were growing on anthropogenic habitats like telephone poles, cement, fences, and benches. And so this is one bench that's in the National Arboretum that has a lot of lichens on it. And so I think that's a sort of fun surprise that, like, oh, this is the human part of the nature habitat, but also the nature came back on it. And so I sort of love that. But the National Arboretum, check it out, is in an urban area with I guess it depends on what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to Beijing, no, it's not high population density, but it has 115,000 people per square mile, which is a lot. And lichens a lot of times grow in habitats with they're more diverse in areas with lower human population densities, sometimes depending also on the climatic factors. And so in the northeast corridor, where there's relatively high population density, you'll find as the population density lowers, the population density of people lowers, the lichen diversity increases. And so of course there are always some lichens, like even in the National Arboretum, like I showed you on that bench, or even on this hickory tree, you can see a couple lichen spots in here, but not as many as you see in a more wild area of Maryland, the Patuxent Research Refuge North Tract, or even a very low population density area of New Jersey with 20 people per square mile. And so this is like one of the classic features of what people think about lichens and how they grow in the environment. Because they're sensitive to air pollution. And so where there are more people, there's more infrastructure, there's more carbon fuel burning. And so that leads to emissions, particularly sulfur dioxide and nitrogen emissions, that are detrimental to many species of lichens. And so particularly people in Europe have done a lot of studies of how lichen population have lichen populations are different depending on the air pollution, and the lichen community itself is less diverse in areas with more pollution. And a few species are completely absent in areas with pollution. And so Usnea species are one of the classic ones that are pollution sensitive. And in Britain, and including here, Physia species are one of these ones that are tolerant to air pollution. So I found a lot of those in lichen surveys in Philadelphia and Camden and New Brunswick and even Washington, D.C. So there are some lichens that are really hardy, that can survive a lot of things, and some lichens that have very specific habitat requirements and so don't survive in these air pollution heavier areas. But we've seen in some places, as air pollution has improved, one lichen researcher, Sally Willwolf, did some really neat work on when people add filtration devices to coal power plants. Over years, the lichen community can recolonize in some of those areas where the lichens were excluded. And so that's a nice and reassuring lichen community story. And so, but I don't like to think of lichens as only delicate flowers that are showing us which are the most pristine and most beautiful and habitats in our area, because they can tolerate a lot of different kinds of stress. And like I was saying, with that study on how the lichen diversity gradient increases as you go north, they can survive in the tundra. And they're really important in the tundra, actually. They're important for sources of food for caribou. And some caribou diet studies have found 80% of the digestive system of the caribou was full of lichens because that's what they were surviving on in the winter. And in honor of this, the star reindeer lichen, or Cladonia stellaris, was recently named the national lichen of Canada by the Canadian Museum of Nature. And that's in part to recognize how important that lichen species is for that whole landscape where the caribou are a quintessential part of that Canadians identify with and care about, just like for Americans our buffalo herds.
Hey, Natalie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Starling was interested. How do they were interested by that photo of under the snow, and how do they cope with these freezing temperatures? Is it the fungi protecting them, or?
No, there's a lot of ways, and part of it has to do, and some of it has to do with that chemical arsenal that the fungus can create, and the lichen itself. Just I found this picture from Radiolab, but I really love the idea of being able to rehydrate raisins into grapes, because this is what happens with lichens. The lichen can dehydrate and rehydrate depending on the water availability. And so similar in the tundra where it's frozen, the lichen can dehydrate so that its cells won't be damaged by ice crystallization. And it can have sugars that help the lichen survive, that help the fungus cells and the algal cells survive the really cold temperatures that other cells would be ruptured by. And so that's one way they survive the cold, is by dehydrating. And so actually, this is a really interesting aspect. And I didn't put some of this research up, but in Antarctica, with global warming, the lichens that were able to survive there, because they had dehydrated, it was dark, it was cold, and the lichens could survive. When it's a little, when it warms up a little and the snow melts a little, those lichens get wet, and so the fungus starts to respire and use some of the sugars. But if it's the wrong time, but if it gets wet before there's a lot of available light there, then the algae can't photosynthesize, and so the carbon balance of that fungus and algae is off. And so that's one of the ways that Antarctic lichen communities are really affected by global warming. And but anyway, the way I'm trying to answer your question is that the lichen can survive the cold by dehydrating, and so it's like hibernating for a lichen, and so it can survive in this dry state over the winter. And similarly, can survive in a dry state over the summer in really hot areas like the Namibian desert from this picture. Or I also included a little screenshot of the lichen flora of the Sonoran Desert region, which I'm sure Chris has used on many occasions, which is an awesome book that shows that showcases some of the great diversity that's in that desert landscape. And because it can survive in those difficult habitats where it's really dry, it doesn't, like plants need soil in part. They need a lot of things from the soil, but one of the things they need from the soil is water. And so the fact that the lichen can dehydrate and rehydrate allows it to survive in these seemingly forsaken habitats of lava flows and glacial recession areas where barely anything else can survive. And when they're growing there, they can capture some airborne debris, they can secrete some chemicals, and they can lead to water retention that helps break up the surface and helps lead to soil formation. Although there's a lot of parts of soil development and soil formation, lichens can play a role in that in some habitats. And since those ways, of showing us where polluted areas are, lichens are interesting because they help with soil formation. Lichens are interesting because they can live in difficult habitats. Lichens are interesting, but they're also interesting because they serve as habitats for other things, and they help introduce you to this amazing world of arthropods. At least they did for me. And so part of my research was about studying these organisms that are living in and around the lichens, particularly the collembolans, which are these two organisms on the left. And I have seen, when doing some lichen surveys, these lacewing larvae that are insects that live on bark, cover themselves with lichens as camouflage, and wait for prey to attack them. I also included a little picture of a tardigrade, which is a similarly dehydratable, rehydratable organism. But some people are not compelled by how interesting and fabulous arthropods are, although they should be. So lichens are also great habitat for birds. And they do great things for people too. They make great backgrounds for selfies, backgrounds for houseplants, backgrounds for train sets, flavoring for liquors, and flavoring for beauty products, including perfumes and deodorants. So if you're not compelled by all the natural reasons about about lichens being fabulous, you might be for these purposes. And then for this season, some people in Sweden use them as Advent candlesticks, although I've only seen that happen on YouTube. I've never seen that in real life. But I forget who it was exactly, said that she was interested in using lichens for dyes. And this is an amazing use of lichens that I've actually never collected lichens in enough volume to use them for dyes, again, because I don't live in the Pacific Northwest. And but there are some areas where you can. And there are some Facebook groups that you can join to find out more about that. And so I just have this picture from Rachel Bingham Kessler, I thought was really neat because she talked about what awesome colors she was able to get from these different lichens. And it's also sort of surprising because you can't really tell by looking at the lichen what color it's going to turn out in the dye vat, because it just has to do with what compound is in there. And there's so many chemical compounds in the surface of the lichen that the one that is responsible for the dyeing process is not obvious based on the outside color of the lichen itself. And many lichens, including usneas, this is a group of lichens that make usnic acid, but many lichens do. And this has been demonstrated in a lot of different studies to be important for medicinal purposes. So the next part, I was going to talk about some lichens that I encounter a lot. And again, because I'm in an urban area, I'm going to be finding a lot of those pollution tolerant lichens, 6 of which are depicted here, relatively pollution tolerant. And Manuela del Forno is one of the lichenologists who helped me figure that out. And she used to be a Smithsonian postdoctoral researcher, and now she's a researcher at Botanical Research Institute of Texas. So if any of you are in Texas, then you have a great lichenology research there or resource there. So one of the classic ones that I've seen on so many street trees is this front and center one, Candelaria concolor, or candle flame lichen. And so it grows in bark, in cities, in rock, in cities, and it grows, and actually it's right next to this gray one, Physia milligrana, or mealy rosette lichen. And so a lot of times those two will occur together on tree bark in urban areas. A little less easy to notice is the orange cord shadow lichen, the one to the left of them, which is dark gray, looks a little indistinct. It has these patches of Sorridia that are distinctive about it. But the other distinctive thing is if you scratch it, it's got orange underneath. So it's like an orange surprise when you're looking at this gray lichen. And so that's a really distinctive feature of it. And there are so many gray lichens. But again, you can tell them apart by their structure, sometimes by their fruiting bodies if they have them. This one, punctilia lichens, have it looks like little white punctuation marks on them. And so those are, if you're looking at a piece of bark with a lot of gray lichens on it, you might have a lot of one species, but you probably have a lot of different species. So get out your little hand lens to check it out a little closer to see all the differences between these different types of gray lichens. And then we have 2 little images of greenish gray lichens, which are the green shield lichen I talked about before, and cladonia lichens, which grow a lot, the squamulose lichens that look like little pieces of cereal, that's the green cereal that's growing on the tree. And sometimes they have fruiting bodies, but if they don't have fruiting bodies, they're a lot harder to identify. I wanted to talk a little, so those are some of the really easy ones to notice, to identify in our area, in the area of Maryland. But I wanted to go into a little more detail about the differences between different lichen species. And one of the examples in the Maryland area is the Parmotrema lichen, which is really beautiful. It's a ruffle lichen, and it has little black cilia, which are little structures coming out the edge, and so it's like it's got a fringe. It's really pretty, But usually when I find them, I say it's Parmotrema because I can't identify the species because the species distinction for this taxon is what kinds of acid it produces inside the fungus. And so these two different species, Parmotrema hypolucinum and Parmotrema hippotropum, look very similar. Both grow in Maryland, although they do grow in different parts of the habitat across the U.S., but their acid production is different. So how can you tell? You can't tell by looking at it, but you can tell by doing thin layer chromatography on it. And so I thought, like, I'm sure most introductory lichen enthusiasts are not going to be doing thin layer chromatography, but it's still really interesting to hear about because it shows you how you can figure out what you can't see. And so this is a neat process where you grind up the lichen, you put it in alcohol, and then you put it on a glass, you put it in a glass plate with a solvent. And just like when, how like if you have a dry sponge and you dip one end of the dry sponge in the water will migrate up the sponge. And similarly, the solvent migrates up the plate. But different components, different chemicals inside the lichen are going to migrate up the plate at different rates. And they're going to stain different colors if you heat it and spray chemicals on it. And so by doing this process, thin layer chromatography, you can separate the different chemicals in the lichen and you can see which species you have if they're only distinguishable by their chemistry. So that's a really, if you like the idea of a chemistry and botany related hobby, then you've got both right here with lichenology.
Hey, Natalie, quick question from
Yes.
the group. Lori is confused about the colors. So they come in all different colors. And are the non-green lichens, are they the cyanobacteria based rather than the green algae based or not?
Oh, great question. Well, no. So in this picture, all of these lichens are green algal lichens. But a lot of times, the lichens with cyanobacteria in them will be a darker color, but all of them could also be green. So you can't tell because the color of the lichen is a lot of time based on the chemistry of the fungus. Like if you have a black lichen, it could be a cyanobacterial lichen or it could be a green algal lichen. But cyanobacterial lichens, the ones I can think of are sometimes darker colored, but again, they could also be gray, they could also be green, and they can also be black. And so the only way you can tell really is by slicing it and seeing what's in there with a microscope or a hand lens, if depending on I think which species you have, you might be able to tell with a hand lens. Although usually I use a microscope because, again, I think it's fascinating and you can see so many neat things in there that you could never see before. Thanks for the question. I wanted to bring up this one to show just like a little bit about different ways that lichens grow in the habitat. And so there's some lichens that are sort of more southern species in North America, like this Brigantia leucoxantha. And there's other species, that are more northern species across the country, like this Tuckermanopsis americana. And I wanted to highlight where this name comes from because Edward Tuckerman was one of the North Americans who described a lot of our lichen species, and he worked in Massachusetts and he explored a lot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And his colleague on his retirement said, no botanist has ever explored the mountains with the same zeal and success. Of course, he only meant the White Mountains, but it's sort of exciting to think about how the lichenology was so inspiring in that area, even though technically the Southern Appalachian Mountains are botanically more interesting and the Rocky Mountains are even more botanically more interesting lichen-wise. This lichen is distributed in a lot of places across the country, but habitat restricted. And also, it looks amazing. So I wanted to include some pictures. When I don't have cladonia as my background, I have had Lobaria pulmonaria as my background because it's so dramatic. It's called lung lichen, and it looks like a lung, except for not pink, green, and not black if it has disease. Green lung lichen. And this one is the biggest lichen. I'm pretty sure that in California, there's an amazing lichen called a lace lichen that just, it could grow and grow and grow. And so I'm sure that that one could be bigger than a person. But the biggest lichen that I've seen is this lung lichen. And posing with it is two lichenologists. And I picked this because, you think, oh, Manuela Del Forno is a lichenologist at the Smithsonian, was a lichenologist at the Smithsonian, and James Lindemer is at New York Botanical Garden, and you have to be affiliated with a botanical institution to be a lichenologist. But no, you can be a lichenologist with any kind of affiliation, because this great lichenologist from Georgia, Malcolm Hodges, was affiliated with the Nature Conservancy and was one of the authors of Breeding Birds of the Breeding Bird Atlas of Georgia. And this great lichenologist, Sean Beeching, is a writer who wrote Dogs in the Bushes, Adventures in Lichenology, with some fun stories about it. So, these people are they are great lichenologists and not affiliated with herbarium institutions. And so I really love that you can make a lot of great contributions to this field, despite what you do in the rest of your day job. But if you do lichenology as the main part of your day job, then you can make a lot of great contributions, like James Lindemer, who's a lichenologist at the New York Botanical Garden. And this is one species that I really like because it grows on Atlantic white cedar trees, which are really beautiful trees of mid-Atlantic region swamps. And he described this species that looks like yellow smear, like you can see on that tree. And if you zoom in on it, like you can with a scanning electron microscope, it looks like balls. It's sort of indistinct. But chemically, it's distinct. And one of the ways you can find that out is by shining a UV light on it. And one of the neat features about lichen chemistry is that they can glow different colors under black light. So check this out. This white tree on the right looks like it's just a tree with white bark, or maybe it has a few diseases on there. Hard to say. But actually, there's 3 different white lichens on there, and you can tell if you put it in the black light because they'll fluoresce different colors. This is a picture from Robert Luking that was in a display from the Canadian Museum of Nature about ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet fluorescence of lichens. Not all lichens do that. Some have no ultraviolet reaction at all, but some of them do. And when you do find those, it's very neat. And lichens aren't the only thing that do that have reactions to ultraviolet light, like some scorpions do.
Hey, Natalie, Chris wants to know if that's the only chrysotherp, I'm saying it incorrectly, that we have in the East.
No, we have a different chrysothrix, which you can find if you look at the James Lindemer book, Lichens of Delmarva. I actually forget. I want to say Chrysothrix xanthina is another one, but I don't remember what its habitat is, so I don't remember where you would find it. I wanted to point out this lichen too, because first of all, it's real. It shows the fact that it's actually sometimes hard to tell if something's a lichen or not. This one looks like a tree. Is it a tree disease? Is it just different coloration of the tree? Hard to tell unless you've got a microscope. And it's actually was just described for the first time in 2017 by James Lindemer. And it's it's documented from very few sites, but probably because barely anybody has looked for it. And it's a generalist on the branches of pine trees. So I liked that it was named after a person who helped broker conservation deals with the Nature Conservancy in Eastern Maryland. And so I thought that was neat. One of the other things I want to point out about its distribution map here is that it goes along the East Coast. Here's Maryland. And then it also continues down to this awesome region of North Carolina. And this region of North Carolina has some of America's species that are threatened by climate change, because that region of North Carolina is very low elevation. And so, for example, this species, Xylobaris nigricans, was first described in 2010, again by James Lindemer. And you can tell maybe why this one was also overlooked, because it looks like black dots. It's hard to distinguish visually without a microscope, but it grows in this really special habitat. And so there are actually several species of lichens that are habitat specialists in these low elevation swamps in this area of North Carolina. And so Jessica Allen and James Lindemer did this study going to lots of areas in this part of North Carolina and documented how very high lichen biodiversity sites with 80 to 100 species each were all in this area between 0 and 1.5 meters of elevation that are likely to be threatened by climate change. And so they're now doing studies about transplanting some of those lichens further inland to see if they'll be able to survive there. But it's an interesting feature of the lichen community here that that these coastal regions have really unique lichens that might be under threat. And of course, not just this part of North Carolina is the region that has had the study done on it, but it might be relevant to other places suffering from coastal inundation. And finally, I want to talk about learning lichens. Like I said, the best way I think is to get in a group and go on walks and go on workshops with people. But if you can't, there's a lot of ways you can learn it anyway, by going online, by going to online talks like this one, or reading great books. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about some groups you can join and potentially go on lichen collecting adventures, maybe in 2021 or 2022. So these, I wanted to highlight some of my favorite websites about lichens. The Portrait Gallery of Stephen Charnoff, who's one of the authors of Lichens of North America, and other great pictures, which help with identification of a lot of things. Of course, like I illustrated, you can't really identify lichens only by pictures in a lot of cases, but sometimes you can. And then Facebook has a lot of great groups where you can post pictures with ID questions, and sometimes you'll get some great helpful answers. I also wanted to highlight this Mushroom and Lichen Dyers United group. For those of you who have, oh wait, what do we got? Stephen Charnoff, yes, a field guide to the California lichens. I think the Stephen Charnoff photos are so amazing, and really they just help. Actually, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of learn more about lichens, is because the Stephen Charnoff photos in Lichens of North America are just so magnificent and make you realize, holy cow, this is just an awesome way to spend your time looking at stuff. A few places where you can go to workshops, maybe, are at the Highlands Biological Station of North Carolina, the Eagle Hill Field Research Institute of Maine, and the New York Botanical Garden, and the Berkeley Herbarium, also, which I didn't put because I'm very sorry to have been so Maryland centered, but when we can go on planes, or if you live in California, why not go to the Berkeley Herbarium workshops, the Jepson Herbarium workshops? And so these are three of my fave books for different purposes. of the Northeast. Again, there's some great California lichen books. There's an amazing Pacific Northwest lichens book. These are sort of Eastern centric, but Lichens of North America, a magnificent, huge book. But it has so many good pictures and so many good introductory ideas about what a lichen is and how it grows and stuff. Common Lichens of North America is like an easier entryway because it's a little smaller, but it's missing a few things. Delmarva Lichens is a really new book that's focused on Maryland. If you're there, check it out. So finally, I wanted to focus on the last bit of this little diagram, which is going on adventures. And the two that I thought of in the Maryland area are with Friends of Patuxent has a lichen group, and Patuxent Research Refuge is a neat spot between Baltimore and DC. And Patapsco Valley State Park has also a friends group that would probably love having a lichen enthusiast come and do some surveys with them. So when you're doing lichen surveys, yeah, you may have a question about that. So what if you come across a lichen like I did, like this in Rock Creek State Park? You can tell it's not bird poop because of the shape. It's round, not dribbly, but of course the lichens are sometimes dribbly, but get a little closer, look at it carefully, take a picture and see if you can run it through a key. But like I said, a lot of times it's good if you take it home, if you have a microscope, but make sure you have a collecting permit if it's in a place like Rock Creek National Park. So if you don't have a collecting permit, you can join a group who might. So there's some great groups. A lot of times lichenologists get sucked into mycology groups because those are housing people who are interested in all sorts of fungi, lichens included. So North American Mycological Association, Philadelphia Mycology Club, and the Washington, D.C. and New Jersey ones I've found to be really friendly. And if you all have some great ideas for mycology clubs that people can join, you can put them in the chat. I've also really enjoyed being part of American Bryological and Lichenological Society, where people who are both moss and lichen enthusiasts can be part of the conversation, again, because a lot of mosses and lichens share the same habitats, so you end up having an enthusiasm overlap there.
Hey, Natalie.
Yeah.
Question. Marty's interested when you said run it through a key.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And then how do you get a collecting permit?
from them. But you have to wait a long time. So it's good if you have like a project that you're planning, but not like if you want to go out for a weekend, it probably won't work that well because it takes a long time to get the permit.
If you're on private property, is it okay? Can you
Yeah,
collect
if you're a private property, yeah, and the landowner says it's fine, or you're the landowner, then you can do whatever you want. But it's important to remember that like that the lichens take a long time to grow back, and so it's better to leave some of it if you collect some of it, so that that population can persist in the wild. And if you do collect it, these are some pictures of lichenologists on collecting adventures. And if you want to show, I can show you on when we go on Lichens of Patuxent sometime in 2021 or 2022. It's better if you collect it in paper. And I know because I collected in plastic recently, and it was moist enough to maintain the growth of bugs, and they chewed through my specimens, and it was terrible. So collect it in paper, and on the paper, write down your critical features about where you got that lichen in case you get back to it like 2 months later, or when you're trying to when you've got your lichen key, when you've got your lichenology friend to help you identify it, just put a guess on the name, put the location where you found it, put a date, and put your name to remember the details of that collection. And one thing you can do is you can compare the stuff that you collected to a specimen in a herbarium. And there's so many great herbaria. Again, I picked the ones around Maryland, but there are so many great herbaria across the nation that you might be near, and if you are, you can visit. And actually, that's the way that I got interested in lichens. Was I was living in Philadelphia, which is the home of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, and I was able to go there, look at these specimens, and figure out, hey, wait a minute, this one does look like the one that I found in the forest, or wait, this one's a little different, and that's why. And so just looking at it, even though the best way to actually identify the lichens is with the chemical and morphological features, it's still really good to be able to wrap your mind around what does a lichen look like, what is it, and how do I recognize it? So looking at those specimens is a neat way, but it's 2020. There's also an online herbarium, which of course you can't look at you can't get as good access to the specimens, but they have a lot of great pictures, and they also have a lot of great data on which lichens are where in historical collections across the country. Another resource that has so many ideas about places of which lichens are where is iNaturalist. This has some problems with identification because, like I said, some lichens are so hard to tell from the pictures what they are. But it's a really neat system because people take a picture, help each other identify things, and so it's a neat way to build community online, I think. And it can help you identify your species if you take a picture of it. It'll ask you what you saw, which you can enter the name there if you've already figured it out. But if you haven't, it says view suggestions. And then it gives you suggestions. And in this case, I picked orange cord shadow lichen. Like I said, it's pretty distinctive. And iNaturalist has a huge database of them because a lot of people have found orange cord shadow lichens. If you're finding a rare lichen, it's probably not going to be in there. So it's probably not going to be that helpful. But for common things, it'll be helpful. And it was the first suggestion. So it can work for identifying, and it's amazing when it does, but it doesn't always work. So, take your iNaturalist suggestions with a grain of salt. So anyway, we had a few questions on the way. If you have more questions now, great. Or you can send them to me at nataliehowe@gmail.com.
Thanks, Natalie. Do you want to stop share and we can all come back together?
I sure do. I'm screen sharing. Stop. There we go.
Yes, Karen, we can make a copy of the PowerPoint available to everybody who is here this evening. I can send it out tomorrow. If y'all can wait till tomorrow, we'll get that done. And does anybody have any questions? Let me look at my question list here, the things that we didn't get covered. One question was, are all of the lichens, can they reproduce sexually and asexually? Or are there some that can just do one or the other? And in particular in the mid-Atlantic region.
That's a great question. I am almost positive that not all can do both. So some of them are, almost all of them are both, but not all of them.
Okay. And then early on, there was just a basic difference between what you're looking at. Is it a moss or a lichen? Is there some kind of telltale?
Ooh, well, to me, it's about the leaves. The moss, it almost, okay. And Chris Wagner, if you want to interject here, my bryology is very elementary, but because a moss can be a really, like it can be a dark color, it can be a light color, it's all the spectrums of green, but it always has, even if they're really, really tiny, it has some kind of leaf structure, whereas a lichen has a, as we saw from the pictures, so many structures it could have.
That is true until you get into liverworts.
Okay.
Once you get into liverworts, you get the thallus, which can be confused with lichens at times. But it's usually very, very green, pretty different. I don't know of any lichens. Well, no, I take that back. There are plenty of lichens that are very, very green and confusing, such as the Peltedres, So you have leafy liverworts and you have thalloid liverworts, and the thalloid liverwort sometimes gets confused with the lichens.
Okay. Now we have to go learn about liverworts.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions do we have going on? You can go ahead and unmute yourself right now and ask Natalie a question if you'd like. Well, I guess you did they know everything, so you did a great job, Natalie. And I'm looking at the crowd, and they all look smarter than when they started. So kudos on that. And because it's a little bit late, I will let y'all off the hook of listening to my shark tooth Christmas song, but I'm giving that to you for homework. So you must navigate to the Natural History Society of Maryland's YouTube page and watch the video. That would be great. While you're there, if you could subscribe, that would be even better. If there are no more questions, again, our heartfelt thanks to Natalie for coming and sharing her time, her expertise, and her knowledge with us. And now it's your turn to go out and take what she has given you and give it to other people. So education is all about sharing and with others, and we can all get smarter together. Everybody be safe. Have a wonderful holiday season. This is our last online program before the end of the 2020 year. So we'll see you in 2021. We hope that we'll see you back here in January and in person very, very soon at our facility in Overley. Everyone take care and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Natalie, are you still there?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Dave. I have one question for you. There's a whole tribe of moths called lichen moths. What is their relationship to lichens? Are they used as host plants?
That is a great question. I was reading about